All right, one of the things is kind of important to know about when you're working with Photoshop or any photo editing program is the histogram. And I'm going to do my best to try to explain it. It's pretty technical, but I think I can do it at least to show you more clearly what it is and how you're impacting the photograph and the histogram when you make edits. So I'm going to go ahead and use Photoshop for this. You don't need Photoshop to do this, but it is one of the better ways to show the histogram. And so basically the histogram is a chart, and it shows the value and the range of values of all the color channels in the photograph. So it literally counts all the pixels at different levels of intensity and brightness, and then shows you a bar graph to show you where those lay out. When a camera is exposing properly, most of that's somewhere in the middle, and that means that they're letting enough light in to see details. If you see that histogram shifted all the way to the right, generally it's overexposed, everything's too bright to be seen, and if it's all the way to the left, it's underexposed and too dark. Probably better to look at this as a black and white photo, because now we're not dealing with the fact that there's multiple colors interacting. We're just looking at the range of colors from the very, very dark, which there's a high amount of them. This is a high contrast shot to start with. So all these really, really dark pixels are being counted here in this point in the histogram. And then a bulk of them are a wide value, wide range of colors in the grayscale from here all the way to about here. And luckily this shot didn't overexpose. This little spike right here is very likely just this spot right here where the sun is overexposing. So this gives you an idea of what it looks like when the pixels are all the way up. Now, most of the edits that you have are dealing with changing that histogram curve and moving things to the left and to the right and seeing the impact. And so when you're doing exposure, for example, you're pretending as though you're letting either more light in, and that whole curve shifts to the right. And I can push it all the way to the right to show you what an overexposed photograph would look like. If this shutter speed had gone longer, that's what the picture would have done. And a lot of times in the past, there's pictures that didn't have computers controlling it, and they're overexposed, and they look exactly like this. If I shift this curve all the way to the left, all of those values move to the other side, and you guessed that this is what an underexposed photograph would look like. So I'm going to go and put that in the middle. Basically, the exposure is changing all levels of the histogram, and sometimes you can do that just by moving right along the histogram, depending on the application that you have. Contrast. And contrast is basically splitting these two values further and further apart. Well, not quite. But what it's doing is bringing higher highs and lower lows so that these are split apart and spread out so that you can see a little bit of definition between the lights and the darks. If you go the opposite direction and you go for a low contrast shot, all the values start to meet in the middle. So you're changing the entire curve of the histogram when you do contrast adjustments. And this still works for color. It's just easier to see when there's only one color value being represented on the wheel. And the other one, when it wasn't in color, when it wasn't in black and white, was harder to read. And so I go on down the road and look and see what this is impacting. Highlights is changing, mostly values on the high end. And so if some of that's overexposed, I can bring that down. And in this case, I'm getting a little bit more range. And so when I lower the exposures, I'm actually seeing a lot more detail in the clouds. And that's kind of how the highlights is working, trying to work on the higher end of the histogram. Shadows is working on mostly the lower end of the histogram, and it's revealing and bringing back some of that detail by digitally moving it out of the underexposed range. But you'll notice too, the more that you deal with the shadow adjustment, and I can't get in closer right now, I can, you'll see a lot of grain in the areas where the shadow is because you're boosting that image. But it's leaving a lot of the higher ends mostly intact. It's not impacting this curve as much as it's impacting this. For whites, it's a shift to the right as well. For the high end, it's another way to get an overexposed, but you'll notice that it's, for the most part, leaving the darker colors alone. And on the opposite end of that, if you see something that says blacks, if you increase it, it's shifting the black to the right and kind of giving it a little more color. But if you want to emphasize and maybe make more of a silhouette, you can drop that all the way down, and now you've taken that range of values of blacks and turn every single pixel into a solid black image by shifting the black to -100, and that just gives you more of a silhouette. But those are some of the basic adjustments that you'll see that are related to value and related to the exposures. And the only difference is if you do that with color, it's basic, and there's not much color left in this picture, but it's basically the same thing, but it's just affecting all the different color scales. So I hope this is helpful for you to understand what those edits are doing when you're working with them on your phone or in Adobe. And Lightroom has basically the same thing. If you look at Lightroom, they'll have exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. If you look at your phone, chances are all of those are affecting light and exposure. And really, again, what you're doing is you're impacting the histogram and changing the look of the image.